At her own grandchild's baby shower, Margaret reached for the quilt she handmade. Her daughter-in-law slapped her hand away. "Don't touch what isn't yours." The room froze. Her son looked away. No one defended her. 3 weeks later, while they were in the hospital delivering the baby, Margaret signed over the deed to a new family that actually wanted her around. When they came home with a newborn, the locks had already been changed. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The baby shower smelled like vanilla cupcakes and lemon-scented floor cleaner. Margaret stood quietly near the back patio door, holding a quilt she'd spent 3 weeks hand-stitching, soft cream cotton, tiny clouds, and birds embroidered across the panels. Her fingers traced the edges as she watched Brittany glide from guest to guest in a flowy pink dress that screamed Instagram perfect. Laughter floated from the living room. Someone clinked a mimosa glass. Margaret stepped forward, tentative but hopeful. "Brittany," she called gently. Brittany turned with a bright smile that faded the instant she saw the quilt. "Oh," she said flatly, as if Margaret were offering her a sack of potatoes. "I made this for the baby," Margaret said, her voice barely above the buzz of conversation. She reached out, unfolding the quilt so the birds caught the afternoon light. It was the same pattern she'd used when Ethan was born. Full circle, she thought. Brittany glanced at it, then slapped Margaret's hand away. Not hard, but loud enough to stop a room. "Don't touch what isn't yours," Brittany snapped. The slap wasn't to the quilt, it was to Margaret. A clean hit, a public one. The entire room went still. The music stuttered, then cut. A child dropped a juice box, and it splattered like a tiny grenade on the hardwood floor. Ethan, standing nearby, let out a brittle laugh. "Britt, come on, she didn't mean—" His voice trailed into irrelevance. Margaret's hand hovered mid-air, then lowered slowly like it belonged to someone else. She folded the quilt back against her chest, smoothing it with both palms. Her face didn't crack. It just hollowed. "Oh my God, did you see that?" Someone whispered. She turned around and walked back to her corner chair, the one by the window no one else had sat in. Her legs felt stiff, like she was walking through wet cement. The quilt settled on her lap and she stared at it as if it belonged to a stranger. A minute passed, then another. People began to chatter again, cautiously at first, then louder, like nothing had happened. A hand appeared at her side, Linda from down the street. She wore a chunky turquoise necklace and smelled of hairspray and citrus. "You okay, hun?" Linda asked softly, offering her a plate with fruit skewers and a mini quiche. Margaret nodded. "Just allergies," she murmured. A lie, but easier than unpacking anything real. Across the room, Brittany was already moving on, rallying the crowd to gather around a giant cardboard box labeled "Boy or Girl" in glitter pen. A camera flashed. Someone cheered. Margaret watched from the corner, feeling like a stranger in her own family. There was her son, arms around Brittany's waist, grinning like the past 15 minutes hadn't happened. There were her old dishes on the buffet, her backyard filled with helium balloons, her hallway crowded with coats that didn't belong to anyone she'd invited. The quilt lay limp on her lap. Margaret traced the stitch lines again, slower this time. "You worked hard on that," Linda said quietly, glancing down. "It's nothing," Margaret replied. She looked out the window, where the wind had picked up, rustling the hydrangeas she'd planted 20 years ago. They were still blooming. No one had watered them in weeks. Inside, Brittany reached for the ribbon on the box, making a show of fluttering her fingers. "Ready, everyone?" she squealed. Margaret leaned forward just slightly, as if that might make her feel part of the moment. It didn't. The box exploded in a cloud of pink confetti. The crowd erupted. Margaret barely blinked. She turned the quilt over, folding it carefully, pressing it between her knees. "Guess it's a girl," Linda said, trying for cheer. Margaret didn't respond. Her eyes had drifted to the hallway, her hallway, where the coat closet door was ajar. Inside, on the top shelf, she knew the old deed papers were still tucked into a dusty manila envelope. She hadn't looked at them in years. Not since Ethan moved in. Not since Brittany called her extra storage. Margaret stood up slowly, the quilt folded tight in her arms. "I need to go check something," she said to no one in particular. She moved past the party and down the hallway, quiet as a whisper, as the house roared behind her in celebration. The house was too quiet when Margaret stepped inside, not peaceful, just empty in that heavy, hollow way a body feels after being bruised. The front door clicked softly, behind her, muffling the fading noise of balloons rustling in the breeze outside. From the living room came the distant hum of someone's laughter, maybe Brittany's mother. But no one noticed Margaret leave. No one followed. She stood in the front hall for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the cool dimness. The scent of lavender plug-ins and old drywall filled her lungs, but the comfort that used to live in this house had long since packed up. Margaret walked slowly down the hall. The baby's nursery door was cracked open. She paused outside, fingers brushing the white wood trim. Inside, the walls were painted in soft mint green, decals of stars and animals pasted on one side with too much symmetry, like someone followed an online tutorial instead of their own instincts. The crib had already been assembled. A fluffy stuffed elephant sat inside, untouched. The windows had new curtains, white lace with pom-poms along the edge. Brittany's taste. Margaret stepped back without entering. She hadn't been asked to help with the nursery. Not to paint, not to sew curtains, not even to suggest a name. She made her way to the end of the hall, to the room that had once been the master bedroom. Now it was a strange hybrid. Margaret's bed on one side, stacked Amazon boxes on the other. A drying rack leaned against the wall where her vanity used to be. Brittany's name was written in Sharpie on the sides of the boxes. Winter clothes, Christmas stuff. Temporary storage, they'd said. She opened the bottom drawer of her dresser. The metal handle creaked, stiff with age and disuse. Beneath some folded sweaters was the manila envelope, worn at the corners, brittle from years of touch and time. She pulled it out slowly and set it on her lap. Inside were the original deed papers, notarized and signed in thick blue ink. The house was still in her name, only hers. Tucked behind the documents was a small, faded photo in a plastic sleeve. Ethan at 7, cheeks sticky with cake frosting, holding a Lego rocket ship with both hands like it was treasure. She touched the edge of the picture, not daring to lift it. Her throat clenched. "What happened to you?" she whispered, almost involuntarily. She knew the answer, of course. It was layered under years of avoidance, blame, and polite detachment. A marriage he rushed into, a wife who never looked her in the eye, a son too spineless to notice the slow erosion of his mother's place in his life. She slipped the photo back inside the envelope and returned the drawer to its place, but she didn't push it all the way shut. The hallway creaked behind her. Dinner time. In the kitchen, Brittany stood at the stove, scrolling through her phone while something bland simmered in a pot. A half-filled glass of white wine sat on the counter, lipstick smeared on the rim. The microwave beeped. Margaret pulled out her plate, baked cod, leftover rice, and a slice of lemon. She moved to the corner of the kitchen island, trying to stay out of the way. Brittany sniffed the air, then wrinkled her nose like someone had dropped a dead rat into her wine. "Ugh, did you seriously microwave fish?" Margaret didn't answer. "I swear, it's like you're trying to haunt this house with your cooking. Maybe try acting like a guest for once." The words sliced through the silence, not screamed, just said with surgical precision, like a warning shot cloaked in sarcasm. Margaret looked up at her, steady. "I didn't realize I needed an invitation to eat in my own home," she said softly. Brittany didn't respond, just rolled her eyes and turned back to her phone. Margaret finished her meal in silence, scraping the last bite of rice slowly, deliberately, like the rhythm of the spoon could drown out the static in her chest. When she stood to rinse her plate, she glanced down the hall again. The nursery door had drifted wider, moonlight pouring in through the gauzy curtains. She dried her hands, walked back to her room, and this time, she didn't close the dresser drawer at all. The cafe was tucked between a florist and a yoga studio, quiet on a Tuesday morning except for the hiss of the espresso machine and the occasional tap of laptop keys. Margaret chose a window seat facing the street. She didn't want to be recognized, though part of her hoped someone might see her and wonder where she'd gone. Across from her, Dana stirred a packet of sugar into her coffee with a calm, deliberate grace. No flashy jewelry, no overly whitened smile, just a neat blazer over jeans and the kind of direct eye contact that made people feel heard. "You're sure it's in just your name?" Dana asked, her voice even, professional. Margaret slid the deed across the table without speaking. Dana opened the folder and scanned it. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but she didn't whistle or gasp, just a low nod of comprehension. "Well," Dana said, "you're not exaggerating. You are the sole owner." "Yes," Margaret replied. No apology, no explanation. She sipped her tea slowly. Dana leaned back, folding her hands. "Do they know that?" Margaret tilted her head, not quite smiling. "They never asked." The two women sat with that for a moment. Outside, a couple walked by pushing a stroller. The baby inside was crying, red-faced, fists clenched. The parents barely looked down. "The market's strong," Dana said after a beat. "Inventory's low, interest is high, especially for properties like yours. Quiet street, decent schools, remodeled kitchen." Margaret gave a dry laugh. "Remodeled by me, before they moved in and called it theirs?" Dana didn't respond with pity. She just nodded and opened her notebook. "What kind of timeline are you thinking?" "Soon," Margaret said. "But quiet. No for sale signs, no open houses. I don't want them to know." "You live there?" "I do, for now." Dana paused, pen hovering above the page. "That's unorthodox, but not impossible. You just have to be precise." Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a smaller folder, photos, receipts, records, neatly organized. Dana accepted it with a nod of respect. "I can be precise," Margaret said. Dana smiled for the first time. "Then we'll do this right." A barista called out a pickup order. Someone clapped in the back as a foam leaf held its shape in a to-go cup. Life in its usual churn. Margaret stood to leave, but paused. "They'll ask questions if I start moving things." "Box up what matters," Dana said. "The rest, they can watch it walk out the door and wonder." As Margaret turned to go, Dana added, "I'll send over a few quiet offers this week. You just tell me when you're ready." Margaret stopped at the door, hand on the knob. "They won't know," she said. "Not until I'm ready." Back at the house, Ethan's voice filtered down the hallway. He was in the bedroom, half-dressed, holding his phone up like a trophy. "She posted the push-present ideas," he called out. "That emerald ring looks just like Mom's." Brittany chimed in from the bathroom. "She never wears it anyway. We could have it reset, maybe in a rose gold band?" Margaret froze at the edge of the hall, just out of sight. "She won't notice," Ethan added. "It's been in her drawer for years." Margaret turned and walked away, slowly, her feet silent on the hardwood. She stepped into her bedroom and opened the top drawer of her nightstand. Inside was the emerald ring. Her mother's, passed down with trembling hands and whispered stories. She didn't put it on. Instead, she found a small velvet pouch and slipped it inside. Then she opened her closet and pulled out a shoebox. The kind with things no one else remembers. By the time dinner rolled around, the ring was gone from the drawer, and Margaret was back at the kitchen island, chopping carrots like it was any other day. But this time there was a faint smile on her face, just one corner of her mouth, and it wasn't for anyone else. The email came through on a quiet Thursday morning. Dana's subject line read simply, "Offer, 183 Meadow Lane." No exclamation marks, no emojis, just business. Margaret opened it at the kitchen table, a black coffee in hand, no sugar. The PDF flickered on her screen. A young couple relocating from Oregon, 2 engineers, no kids yet, pre-approved financing, and willing to go $20,000 over asking for a quick close. Dana's message was short, serious buyers. They love the garden, want to move fast, discretion intact, of course. Margaret didn't reply right away. She stared at the offer, reading it 3 times, fingers curling slightly around her mug. Then, in a move that felt both absurd and deliciously final, she clicked reply and typed 2 words, accept it. She closed the laptop gently, as if the decision might break if handled too hard. Outside the kitchen window, a sparrow darted from the hedges, Fast, weightless, free. The next morning, she was wiping down the counter when Brittany swept into the room in one of her oversized pajama sets that said, "Wifey," in gold letters. She stopped short, wrinkling her nose. "Your pills are everywhere," Brittany said, plucking a small orange bottle off the counter like it was radioactive. "It's not a pharmacy, Margaret. Maybe keep your clutter in your quarters?" Margaret said nothing. She took the bottle and placed it silently in the cabinet above the sink. Her cabinet. It still held her things, her labels, her system, but it didn't feel like hers anymore. Ethan walked in mid-yawn, his hair damp, a muscled arm wrapped around a protein shake. "Hey, babe, I was thinking, after the baby comes, we could convert Mom's room, like, into an office/podcast space?" Margaret didn't flinch. "Could be a tax write-off," he added, looking at Brittany. "Or a nursery overflow," she replied with a smirk. "She'll be out soon enough." Margaret set her coffee cup down with a little more force than necessary. Later that afternoon, while they were both out, Ethan at the gym, Brittany at a prenatal yoga class, Margaret climbed the pull-down ladder to the attic. The light bulb hummed above her, casting long shadows across boxes labeled in her handwriting. Christmas, 2004, Ethan, grade school, taxes, keep. She pulled out a modest moving box and began to fill it slowly. A quilt. Her grandmother's mixing bowl. The recipe card with her mother's handwriting for beef stew, stained at the edges from too many winters. No one called to ask what she was doing. No one cared enough to look. By Sunday, the sales contract was signed. The closing was set for 30 days. Dana had driven over in her silver Prius with a pen and a neutral face. "They're thrilled," she said softly, as Margaret signed page after page on the front porch. "You'll get a wire transfer before the movers even pull up." Margaret nodded, eyes fixed on the paper. Each signature felt like a breath exhaled after holding it for too many years. "Everything okay?" Dana asked. Margaret didn't look up. "Everything's finally mine again." Inside, the hallway was filled with the sound of Ethan watching football at full volume, shouting at the screen. Brittany's voice echoed from the bathroom, complaining about her ankles. Margaret slid the signed documents back into the envelope and handed them to Dana like she was passing off a bomb. In a way, she was. That night, she stood in the garage, alone, the only sound the slow tick of the overhead light cooling down. She placed a stack of packed boxes into a far corner, covering them with an old blanket. Labeled nothing. Marked for no one. Inside, Brittany was on a call, giggling to someone about birth photographers and our little home. Margaret stood in the shadows, listening. Her fingers curled lightly around the garage doorknob. "They have no idea," she thought. Not a clue. And they wouldn't. Not until the ink dried. Not until the day the locks changed. Not until the only house they ever claimed to love no longer belonged to them. The moving company didn't advertise online. Margaret had gotten the number from Linda, slipped across a garden fence with the sort of look women exchanged when they knew not to ask questions. She dialed the number from the laundry room, the dryer masking her voice. "End of the month. 2 men. Cash only," she said. The man on the line asked no personal questions, just gave her a price and promised a quiet crew. Perfect. She hung up and wrote the name Travis, March 28th at 8 a.m. in the corner of a grocery list between milk and toothpaste. Then she tucked the list inside her coat pocket. Let them think she was planning another trip to Safeway. That afternoon, Margaret opened the attic again. This time she brought up a few fresh cardboard boxes from the garage and worked slowly, layering each one like a time capsule. A cracked photo frame here, her wedding album there, the dish towel embroidered with M, 1972 that only she remembered had once been a wedding gift. Everything she packed had weight, not just in mass, but in memory. But nothing screamed sentimental. If anyone asked, the boxes could be explained away. Old junk, donations, just tidying up. Brittany, meanwhile, was in full nesting mode. Margaret watched from the hallway as she posed in front of the fireplace, holding her belly and adjusting the sash on her maternity dress while Ethan fiddled with lighting. "I think the chaise should go over here for the photos," Brittany said, dragging a piece of chalk across the floor to mark angles. "That way the baby bump pops in the morning light. Ethan nodded distractedly. We could drape that blue quilt on the armrest too, the one Mom made. The old thing? Brittany scoffed. I mean, maybe if we style it right, it does give heritage vibes. Margaret's hands, gripping a basket of laundry, stiffened just slightly. Brittany turned back to the room and added almost casually, Anyway, we earned this house putting up with her. The sentence landed with a thud, loud in its casual cruelty. Margaret didn't move, didn't breathe. Earned. As if the hours of her life scrubbed into these walls meant nothing. As if the mortgage she'd paid off alone and the lawn she still mowed on Saturdays were currency they'd been forced to suffer through. She turned back down the hallway, not trusting herself to speak. That night, long after the lights were out, Margaret slipped into the living room with her phone. The house was quiet, except for the soft ticking of the mantel clock and the refrigerator hum. She stood in the center of the room and slowly turned, taking photos. The kitchen, the bay window, the fireplace with its cracked brick she'd meant to fix, but never did. She captured the worn places, things a stranger might call flaws, but that she called life. Then she moved down the hallway and photographed the nursery, lit only by a nightlight in the shape of a moon. She sent the photos to Dana with a short note. As promised. Still ours, for now. Then she went to her bedroom, pulled down the shoebox from the closet, and removed a mini DV camcorder, Ethan's old one, long, obsolete, but still working. She popped in a cassette marked Summer 1993 and hit play. The screen glowed dimly. The picture was grainy. Ethan's tiny voice echoed in the dark. "Mommy, look! I made it fly!" He ran through a sprinkler with a towel as a cape, laughing so hard he fell. Margaret's voice came through off-camera, warm and real. "You're a superhero, sweetheart." She covered her mouth with one hand. Not to cry, to keep from calling him. 5 days. Margaret had circled the date on her wall calendar with a dull pencil, light enough to erase. She marked nothing else. No appointments, no birthdays. Just a number, 28. The last full day she'd spend as a silent ghost in her own home. That morning she sat in her room with a spiral notepad and made calls one by one. Mail forwarding, water and electric shutoff, internet transfer. Each voice on the line treated her with mild confusion. No, the name on the account was hers. Yes, she was sure she wanted it canceled. "Big move?" someone asked. "Fresh start," Margaret replied. She hung up and opened the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. Inside were Ethan's old crayon drawings, spaceships, family stick figures, a crooked dog that once lived 16 faithful years. She shuffled through them slowly, lifting the edges like she might reveal something new. Each one held its own ache. She placed the drawings into a keepsake box and sealed it shut. Not for Ethan, not for anyone else, just for her. Down the hall, Brittany was cooing on the phone again. Margaret passed by the kitchen just in time to hear her voice float out. "Once the baby's here, we'll do the housewarming. Thinking champagne brunch, backyard tent, baby balloons. It'll be like the final reveal, you know? Our forever home, finally complete." Margaret paused in the shadow of the stairwell. Forever home. She almost laughed. But instead she went to the linen closet, pulled out an overnight bag, small, navy with one wheel that squeaked, and set it under her bed. She filled it with essentials: 3 outfits, toiletries, her mother's ring, a tiny jar of lavender cream. No one noticed. Later that afternoon, Margaret stepped outside with a trash bag and ran into her neighbor Jim, walking his golden retriever. "Hey there, Margaret," he said, giving a tug on the leash. "Looks like we're getting a heat wave again." "So it seems," she replied, wiping her hands on her apron. Jim looked her over, his eyes pausing on the drawn expression she hadn't bothered to mask. "You all right?" Margaret nodded. "Just finishing up some things." "You heading somewhere?" She smiled faintly. "I'm leaving soon." Jim blinked, but didn't push. He nodded once, respectfully. "Well, wherever you're headed, I hope it's somewhere good." She gave a half nod, turned, and walked back inside. The door clicked softly behind her. That evening, the air in the house was sharp with tension, the kind that doesn't announce itself but hangs from the ceiling like humidity. Brittany had just come back from a prenatal appointment and slammed the car door harder than usual. She walked through the front hallway, bags in hand, muttering about swollen feet and inconsiderate scheduling. Ethan trailed behind, trying not to step on landmines. "You should lie down, babe. Just breathe. We can order takeout." "I don't want takeout," Brittany snapped. "I want that woman to stop leaving her tea bags in the sink like it's a retirement home." Margaret, in the kitchen rinsing a plate, didn't respond. "I mean it, Ethan," Brittany barked, kicking off her shoes in the hallway. "I want her gone after this baby comes. I don't care where she goes. A hotel, a grave, whatever." The words hit the air like a match in a dry field. Ethan said nothing. Margaret finished rinsing her plate and set it in the drying rack with surgical calm. She wiped her hands, walked back to her room, and sat on the edge of her bed. The suitcase under it was zipped and ready. The boxes in the attic were stacked just so. The mail was already rerouted. The utilities set to end. Everything had been checked twice. She reached for the envelope on her nightstand, a copy of the closing documents, crisp and official. Margaret lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, her hands folded neatly on her stomach. Let them rage. Let them plan brunch. Let them think they were building a legacy on borrowed ground. It started with a scream, not the kind of scream that signaled danger, but the sharp, panicked wail of someone whose body had turned against her in the middle of folding laundry. Margaret heard it from the hallway, Brittany's voice, breathless, cursing between contractions. Ethan bolted down the stairs half-dressed, keys already in hand. "Hospital bag! Where the hell is the bag?" he shouted as if the house might answer. "In the front closet," Margaret said calmly from the kitchen doorway, pointing. Ethan didn't thank her. He grabbed the duffel and ran back toward the front, calling to Brittany, who hobbled to the Ouija car with one hand on her belly and the other on the doorframe. "Stay here," Brittany snapped, waving Margaret off like static. "Don't start playing grandma just because it's convenient now." Margaret didn't flinch. She just nodded once and stepped aside. The car roared out of the driveway, tires crunching gravel. Then, silence. A silence so complete it rang. Margaret stood at the base of the stairs, one hand resting on the banister, the other still clutching a dish rag. The whole house, so often filled with Brittany's clatter and Ethan's mindless chatter, now felt like a cathedral. Empty, echoing, holy in its quiet. She exhaled, then moved. She climbed the stairs and went room by room, pulling items off shelves with methodical grace. Labels she'd pre-written on sticky notes now found their homes. Books, donate, linens, keep, kitchenware, new owners. She opened closets and marked hangers, pulled drawers and emptied them into boxes already half-packed and tucked under beds. In the nursery, she paused. The elephant nightlight still glowed on the dresser, casting soft, slow-moving shadows across the mint-green walls. A plush giraffe leaned against the crib, the mobile hung above, still turning lazily from the ceiling fan's breeze. Margaret set a small white envelope on the windowsill. Inside, a note. "Take care of this place. It deserves laughter. M." She didn't linger. Afternoon bled into early evening. The light shifted in every room, turning gold, then bruised lavender. Margaret sat in her chair by the window, hands folded in her lap, the house now boxed and labeled like a museum being decommissioned. Her phone buzzed. Text from Ethan. It's a boy, no name, no picture, just a flat digital sentence. Margaret stared at it for a long time. She didn't cry, she didn't even sigh. Instead, she smiled. Small, warm, real. Then she opened her contacts and tapped Dana's name. Dana picked up on the second ring. "I saw the timestamp," she said. "Congratulations, Grandma." Margaret let out a soft chuckle. "Let's close it." There was a pause on the other end. Then, "I'll make the call. New owners sign in the morning. I'll prep their key packet tonight." Margaret leaned back into her chair, the sun hitting her face through the window like a final blessing. Her fingers brushed the armrest, polished oak, worn smooth over decades. The floorboards creaked under her slippers as she stood and crossed the living room. She flicked off the lights one by one until only the kitchen glowed. She opened the fridge, took out a bottle of ginger ale and poured herself a glass. The bubbles fizzed up and then fell quiet. It was done. Outside, a bird landed on the porch railing, tilting its head toward the bay window. Inside, Margaret stood in the middle of her living room, now bare and echoing, the ghost of a home already past. Ethan and Brittany were holding a newborn in a hospital room filled with flowers and helium balloons, blissfully unaware. Their baby had been born, and their house had been sold. The minivan pulled into the driveway with the slow, self-important crawl of royalty arriving home. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the lawn. Margaret had mowed herself less than a week ago. She watched from the front window as Ethan got out first, wearing the dazed grin of a man who'd just crossed some invisible threshold. He moved quickly around the car and opened the passenger door with an awkward flourish, like someone reenacting a scene from a parenting video. Brittany stepped out carefully, holding the baby against her chest in a new sling that still had the store tag on it. Her hospital bracelet flapped gently in the breeze. Her eyes were tired, rimmed in smeared mascara, but her chin was high. She looked like a queen returning to a castle she thought was hers. Margaret opened the door before they reached it. She didn't say much, just held it wide with a nod of acknowledgement, as if greeting returning tenants, not family. "Congrats," she said softly. Ethan smiled. "Thanks, Mom." Brittany swept past her without making eye contact. "Try not to infect him with that passive-aggressive aura," she muttered, brushing her shoulder against the doorframe as she passed. Margaret didn't respond. She simply closed the door behind them with a gentle click and followed them into the living room. The baby, a boy, small and red-faced and swaddled in something monogrammed, slept soundly in Brittany's arms. Ethan fussed with a diaper bag, setting it on the couch, adjusting it, then moving it again. "I figured we'd rest a little, then maybe introduce him to the house," Ethan said, looking around like the walls might applaud. "You know, first impressions." "Lovely," Margaret replied, her voice cool and calm. Brittany lowered herself slowly onto the couch, letting out a theatrical sigh as if every muscle in her body had carried the weight of the world. "I need tea," she declared, "or sparkling water, or something." Cold, Ethan jumped up. "I'll get it." As he disappeared into the kitchen, Brittany leaned her head back against the couch and closed her eyes. The baby stirred slightly but didn't cry. Margaret stood in the archway, arms crossed loosely. She looked not at the baby, but at the room, at the boxes she'd tucked discreetly into corners, at the light switch covers she'd cleaned just yesterday for the last time, at the indentations on the carpet where the coffee table used to sit. This wasn't home anymore. "Don't worry," Brittany said without opening her eyes. "We'll manage without you just fine once you're out of here." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "I'm sure you will." Ethan returned with a bottle of water, which he handed off like a ceremonial offering. Brittany unscrewed it with one hand and took a long drink. "You're leaving eventually, right?" Ethan asked, glancing at Margaret as if trying to confirm the exit plan without making it a scene. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. The boy in the home videos was still there, buried under the man who stood now in this room. She wondered if he'd feel it when the floor shifted beneath him, if there'd be even a flicker of recognition for what he'd lost. "Sooner than you think," she said. Ethan gave a forced laugh, like he wasn't sure if it was a joke. Then, ding-dong. The doorbell echoed through the house like a slow, ringing verdict. Brittany jolted upright, clutching the baby tighter. "Who the hell is that?" Ethan frowned. "We're not expecting anyone." Margaret moved toward the door without hesitation, her gait calm, practiced. She didn't look back. The baby began to stir. Outside, through the beveled glass, a neutral figure stood, Dana's assistant, a black folder in hand, expression unreadable. Behind her, parked discreetly at the curb, a compact car idled. Margaret reached for the doorknob, but didn't open it just yet. She glanced back once at the family behind her, perched on a couch in a house that no longer belonged to them. "Right on time," she whispered. The door opened with a soft whoosh of air. Dana's assistant stood squarely on the mat, black slacks pressed, blouse tucked, a leather folder in hand like a quiet blade. Behind her, the compact car idled with the engine still running. This was not a long visit. "Ms. Langley?" she said politely, though her eyes flicked past Margaret into the house behind her. Yes, Margaret answered. The assistant handed over the folder and gave a single nod. Keys are in the packet. The buyers will arrive Monday to walk through. Movers will follow. Please confirm if you need final disposal services. No, thank you, Margaret said. Everything's already in motion. The woman hesitated just a second. Good luck, she said softly, then turned and walked away. Margaret closed the door and turned back toward the living room. Ethan was now standing. Brittany was still seated, adjusting the baby's blanket with one hand while squinting toward the foyer. What was that? She asked sharply. Who was that? Margaret walked into the room slowly, like she had all the time in the world. Just a delivery, she said, setting the folder on the coffee table and stepping back. Brittany reached for it before Ethan could. She flipped it open and scanned the first page, her lips moving soundlessly as her eyes darted over the header. It took 2 lines. Then, "What the hell is this?" Her voice cut through the house like a fire alarm. Ethan grabbed the folder from her and began flipping through, page after page, his eyes growing wider by the second. His hands trembled as he scanned the legalese. Final sale agreement, buyer transfer documents, notarized deed. Mom, he stammered. This says you sold the house? Margaret nodded once. 30-day close. Yesterday. You... Ethan looked up, bewildered. You didn't even tell us? I didn't owe you that, she said calmly. Brittany stood, clutching the baby. You're insane. This has to be a mistake. This isn't even your house anymore. Oh, but it was, Margaret said. Every inch, every beam, every mortgage payment, mine. Brittany looked down at the pages again, her voice rising. You can't just sell a house with people in it. With a baby coming, you think this is some kind of joke? No, Margaret said. It's a correction. She turned and walked down the hallway toward her room, the soft wheel of her suitcase humming as she pulled it out from beneath the bed. The zip gave a quiet rasp as she closed it. Her movements were steady, almost ceremonial. Back in the living room, Brittany's shriek rose behind her. You have no idea what kind of legal trouble you just started. We will sue you, you bitter old... Margaret reappeared at the end of the hallway, suitcase in hand, coat over her arm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even stop walking. This home was never yours to disrespect, she said. You were just passing through. Brittany moved toward her, the baby crying now, little fists flailing in protest. You can't just walk out and drop this bomb and think it's over? Margaret paused near the front door. Oh, it's very much over, she said. Then, with the faintest smile, you'll be out before you can print the papers. Ethan stepped forward, still holding the folder like it might burst into flames. What about the baby? You'll never see him again. Margaret turned the knob, pulling the door open to the late afternoon breeze. That will be your choice, she said, like everything else you've chosen. The baby screamed louder now, sensing the storm in the room. Brittany tried to soothe him, rocking too hard, her hand clumsy and frantic. Margaret looked at him, just for a moment. Then she stepped outside. The door clicked shut behind her. The apartment was nothing special by brochure standards. Neutral walls, laminate counters, light fixtures that hummed a little when the heat kicked on. But it had 3 things that mattered most to Margaret Langley. A working lock, a patch of sunlight that touched the living room floor each morning, and silence. Real silence. Not the kind weighed down by tension and swallowed words. This silence was breathable, spacious. She stepped inside, the doormat whispering against her shoes. The air smelled like new carpet and lemon oil. Her small suitcase rolled gently behind her as she closed the door, locking it twice. She stood there for a moment, hand on the knob, as if waiting to hear footsteps coming down the hall, a voice calling out her name with irritation. None came. She smiled. Dana had handled everything. First month paid, utilities set up, fridge stocked with basics. A note on the counter read, keys and remote inside drawer. And yes, there's Wi-Fi. Call me when you're ready to breathe again. D. Margaret made tea in the little kitchenette and sat down at the table near the window. She held the warm mug between both palms and looked around. It was plain, yes, but empty in a way that didn't feel lonely, just blank, like a page waiting to be written. She opened her laptop, the Wi-Fi blinking on. A FaceTime request popped up almost instantly. Call from Allison, Dana's sister. Margaret hesitated for half a second, then accepted. Allison's face appeared, smiling, soft-eyed, wearing a hoodie and a headband. The sound of clinking dishes and laughter in the background suggested a small cafe. "Margaret, you made it," she said. "How's the place? Dana said you'd landed." "It's simple," Margaret said, in the good way. "I love simple. I always say, less mess, more space to feel." Allison leaned closer to the camera. "You still on for brunch Sunday? No pressure, just eggs, gossip, and coffee that doesn't taste like floor cleaner." "I'll be there," Margaret replied. "You're family now," Allison said. "No invitations needed?" When the call ended, Margaret sat back in her chair, phone resting on her lap. No invitations needed. Her eyes pricked unexpectedly, but she blinked it away. Over the next few hours, she unpacked slowly, methodically, a book of Mary Oliver poems on the nightstand, a pothos plant on the windowsill, the blue and white porcelain teacup from her mother's old set beside the sink. Just enough to make the place breathe a little warmer. In the bedroom, she arranged her sweaters by color, something she hadn't had the freedom to do in years without someone making a snide remark about her compulsive organizing. The closet had a top shelf, wide and empty. She placed the keepsake box there, the one with Ethan's old drawings, and then shut the door softly. She didn't label it. It was just after 6 p.m. when her phone buzzed again. Text from Dana. "Thought you'd want to see this." There was a photo attached. Margaret tapped it open. It was taken from across the street, Ethan and Brittany standing on the front lawn of 183 Meadow Lane, boxes stacked near their feet. Brittany's mouth was mid-yell, face red. Ethan's shoulders were slumped. The baby carrier sat on the driveway beside them like an afterthought. The new owner's car was parked in the driveway behind them. No more porch light, no more welcome mat. They looked like guests overstaying their welcome. Margaret stared at the photo for a long moment, then quietly saved it to her phone. She stood, crossed the apartment, opened the top drawer of her small writing desk, and slid the phone inside. Then she shut the drawer with a soft, final click. No triumph, no gloating, just closure. She turned toward the kitchen, humming something under her breath. Maybe tomorrow she'd bake. Leave something by the neighbors' doors. Learn someone's name just for the joy of using it. She paused by the window, watching the sun stretch across the floor. This wasn't where her story ended. But for the first time in a long while, it wasn't where someone else's began. Margaret found the envelope between a utility bill and a grocery flyer, pale pink, hand-addressed, with no return address. The handwriting was slightly uneven, looped letters, trying their best to look formal. She almost tossed it in the pile meant for recycling, but something about the color stopped her. She sat down at the kitchen table, still in her robe, tea cooling beside her, and slid her finger beneath the flap. Inside was a folded sheet of lined paper torn from a spiral notebook. "Dear Ms. Langley, you probably don't remember me, but I served you a few times at the Pine and Oak Diner. I'm the one who always called you ma'am and asked if you wanted your water with lemon. One day, a few months back, you started coughing while I was refilling your tea, and I held your hand until you could breathe again. You smiled and said, 'Thank you for treating me like I matter.' I never forgot that." Margaret paused, her chest tight. "I wanted to write and say thank you. For your kindness, for always tipping me well, even when all you got was soup and a biscuit. For not treating me like I was invisible. That's rare. I'm 22. I'm pregnant. It wasn't planned. I work 2 jobs, and I'm scared all the time, but I remember how calm your voice was that day, how soft your hand felt in mine. Like grace, I guess. I hope you're doing okay. You seemed like someone carrying a lot. I hope you found somewhere lighter to set it down. Julia, your waitress, table 6. Margaret sat very still. The clock ticked behind her, slow and indifferent. Outside, someone was walking a dog and laughing into a phone. A bus whooshed by. A neighbor watered a potted fern. But inside, Margaret couldn't move. Not because she was upset, but because something warm and unfamiliar had bloomed in her chest like a candle lighting in a room long sealed off. She wiped her cheek with the side of her palm and exhaled through her nose. Someone had noticed. Someone had seen her, not just as an old woman microwaving fish or taking up space, but as a person, a human being. And not only that, someone who mattered enough to write to. She stood up slowly, went to her bedroom, and retrieved the keepsake box from the closet. She took out a card, blank, pale blue, with a tiny gold tree embossed in the corner. She sat back down and wrote, "Dear Julia, yes, I remember you. You held my hand like you meant it. That day mattered more than you knew. I'm doing okay now. I hope you will be too. Call me if you ever want to talk, or just sit. There's no rule that says you have to go through all this alone. Warmly, Margaret." She slipped a small gift card and a folded check inside. Nothing grand, but enough to buy a crib or a few weeks of groceries. Then she added her new address and phone number in case the girl really did want to call. Before sealing the envelope, Margaret stared at Julia's letter again. "You seemed like someone carrying a lot." She smiled, softly, almost in disbelief. This girl, barely a woman, pregnant and scared and waitressing double shifts, had seen something in her that her own son hadn't noticed in a decade. And somehow, had cared. That night, Margaret placed the new envelope on her hallway table, ready to walk it to the mailbox in the morning. She poured herself a glass of wine, cheap, boxed, just enough sweetness to soften the end of the day, and sat in her armchair by the window. She watched the city dim. She didn't think about Ethan. She didn't think about the house. She thought about Julia. And for the first time in a long, long time, she didn't feel old. She felt needed. The call came just after sunrise. Margaret hadn't even poured her first cup of tea. Her phone buzzed with Ethan's name flashing across the screen, the same name that once meant joy and scraped knees and bedtime stories. Now it made her stomach settle like a stone. She let it ring twice before answering. "Hello? Mom?" His voice was tight, brittle with panic. "Tell me this isn't real. Please, she's losing it. She hasn't stopped crying since yesterday." Margaret walked to the window, pulled the curtain back an inch, and watched the city stretch awake. Joggers, a bus brake sighing, a woman balancing a coffee and a toddler. "It's real," she said calmly. "Very real." "You sold the house out from under us," he said. "You blindsided your own family." She didn't answer that. Not because there wasn't an answer, but because the only one that mattered had already been delivered in signatures and a notarized seal. Ethan took a breath. "You'll never see your grandson again if this is how you want things." Margaret stared out at the street. That baby deserves better than to grow up around cruelty disguised as love. "You think you're the victim in all this?" he snapped. "You've ruined our lives. For what? Some righteous tantrum in your golden years?" "No, Ethan," she said, her voice steady. "This wasn't a tantrum. It was a boundary. You just never noticed I had any until I enforced one." Silence crackled on the line. Then he hung up. Margaret set the phone down gently, no harder than she'd place a teacup. It was 2 days later when Brittany showed up. Margaret had just returned from the mailbox. A small bag of groceries in hand, bread, tomatoes, mint for tea, when she saw the figure storming up the sidewalk, a blur of beige leggings and fury. Brittany didn't knock. She pounded. "Open this door, you miserable old thief!" Margaret didn't move. "You think you're safe? You think you can just walk away after everything you took from us?" Still, Margaret stood in the entryway, keys in hand, gaze steady. "You're going to pay for this, Margaret!" Brittany shrieked. "I swear on my child, you'll regret this!" The building manager emerged from the stairwell seconds later, cell phone already out. Margaret didn't need to ask. He'd seen this kind of thing before. Security footage would handle the rest. The restraining order was filed the next morning. Dana's lawyer walked Margaret through it step by step. Simple, clean, ironclad. The judge didn't hesitate. Brittany's outburst had been recorded, transcribed, and tagged with 2 separate building reports. No contact, no harassment, no proximity allowed within 100 feet of Margaret's residence. By the end of the day, Margaret had the signed order in hand and a new emergency contact filed with her building's front desk. She made tea that night and sat at her desk with a small pen and a legal folder. Inside were all the documents, the house sale, the restraining order, and her revised will. She opened the last one, 6 pages printed on ivory paper, notarized and sealed. A former copy had listed Ethan as her sole beneficiary. This one did not. She read the name quietly, just once. Julia May Whitaker, the girl from the diner. No one else? Not anymore. Margaret pressed her thumb into the seal and folded it back into the folder. Then she locked it in her desk drawer. That night, her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. She didn't answer. No voicemail followed. She didn't need to guess who it was. Instead, she poured herself a second glass of wine and walked barefoot to the window. The city glittered beneath her like a promise. Her past was behind locked doors now, and her future, unwritten. But this time, no one else would hold the pen. The knock came mid-afternoon, 2 soft taps, hesitant and unsure. Margaret had just finished washing the breakfast mugs, the lemon dish soap still clinging faintly to her hands. She wiped them on a towel and approached the door cautiously, half expecting a solicitor or another misdialed delivery. But when she opened it, the girl on the other side wasn't selling anything. Julia stood there in an oversized coat, her curls pulled into a loose braid, a bouquet of grocery store daisies clutched in both hands like an apology. "I'm sorry to come by without calling," she said quickly, cheeks flushed. I was in the area. I thought maybe—" She stopped, catching her breath. "I just wanted to say thank you in person. For everything." Margaret didn't answer right away. She studied the girl's face. The dark half-moons under her eyes, the way her shoulders curled inward as if apologizing for existing. Then she opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. They sat at the small kitchen table, the daisies now sitting in a repurposed pickle jar. Margaret poured 2 mugs of tea and added honey to Julia's without asking. Somehow she knew she'd take it that way. Julia glanced around the apartment. Small, sunlit, spare. "It's nice," she said quietly. "It's mine," Margaret replied. That brought a smile from the girl, a real one, even if faint. They sipped in silence for a few minutes. Julia set her mug down, fingers nervously circling the rim. "I didn't think you'd write back," she said. "Most people don't even look up when they hand me their card. You were different." Margaret tilted her head. "How so?" "You looked me in the eye." Julia laughed, embarrassed. "It sounds stupid, but when you're pregnant and poor and working night shifts on your feet, it's easy to start thinking you're invisible." "You're not," Margaret said simply, "and it's not stupid." Julia's eyes glistened. She quickly blinked it away. "I've been thinking about applying to the LPN program at City Tech. I used to help take care of my granddad, and I loved it even when it was hard. I think I'd be good at nursing, but it's 2 years, and I can't afford daycare and classes and rent without—" Her voice trailed off. Margaret said nothing, just listened. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, just open, like the kind you sit in when someone is offering you something sacred, their future, raw and unfinished. "I don't want a handout," Julia added, "but I want to try. I want this baby to grow up seeing me build something, even if it's small." Margaret reached across the table, her hand light on Julia's. "I'd like to help," she said, "with tuition and whatever else you need to get started." Julia froze. Her lips parted as if to protest. "I'm not buying anything," Margaret said gently. "I'm investing in someone who sees the world clearly, who shows up, who treats strangers with grace and chooses kindness anyway." Tears welled again in Julia's eyes, but this time she let them fall. She covered her mouth with one hand and whispered, "No one's ever believed in me like that, not even my mom." "You don't need the whole world to believe in you," Margaret said. "You just need one person to hold the light long enough for you to find your footing." The girl wept softly. No theatrics, no noise, just release. Margaret stood, fetched a tissue and pressed it into her palm. Then she sat back down and let the room be quiet again. Outside, a child shouted from a playground. A train rumbled faintly overhead. The world carried on. But inside the apartment, two women shared something rarely spoken aloud. A beginning. When Julia left an hour later, eyes clearer, shoulders straighter, Margaret stood at the door watching her descend the stairs. She didn't close the door right away. Instead, she lingered, her hand on the frame, watching sunlight stretch across the hallway like it had been waiting for her to notice it. She exhaled, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like she was letting something go. It felt like she was letting something in. The baby shower was held in the back room of a modest neighborhood bakery. Ceilings low, the smell of fresh bread mingling with vanilla frosting and faint nervous laughter. String lights ran across the beams like borrowed stars, and someone had arranged mismatched chairs around folding tables draped in soft blue plastic cloths. Margaret stood in the doorway, gift bag in hand, unsure whether to step in. Then Julia spotted her. She broke into a grin so wide it pushed the exhaustion from her face. "You came," she said, weaving between tables with arms already outstretched. Margaret returned the hug gently, mindful of the belly between them. "I said I would," she replied. Inside, the space buzzed with warmth, not the forced cheer of Brittany's baby announcements or gender reveals, but the kind of warmth built from people who had seen each other cry in restrooms or share fries at midnight between shifts, people who weren't pretending to be anything but human. Julia introduced Margaret as a dear friend, and then, without hesitation, added, "And someone who changed my life." That drew smiles and nods, not confusion. Margaret was led to a chair with a paper fan tucked underneath for the heat and a tiny cupcake waiting at her place. No one asked her why she was there. No one side-eyed her with the suspicion of an outsider. She belonged without having to earn it. Later, while plates were being cleared and the room quieted into that lull of cake-induced sleepiness, someone with a camera called out, "Group shot!" Julia rolled her eyes fondly. Okay, everyone squeeze in. Aunties, cousins, chaos and all." People arranged themselves with practiced chaos, laughing and elbowing for space. Then Julia turned to Margaret. "Would you stand next to me?" Margaret blinked. "Are you sure?" Julia nodded, already reaching for her hand. "You're part of this." Margaret rose, heart oddly loud in her chest, and moved slowly toward the group. She took her place beside Julia, her hand hovering for a moment before gently resting on the girl's shoulder. Steady, warm, welcome. The camera clicked. No one flinched. No one slapped her hand away. Just light and memory. As people filtered back to their seats, Julia turned and pressed a small gift bag into Margaret's hands. The tag was handwritten, scrawled in looping ink. "To my child's godmother, if you'll have us." Margaret's breath caught. She looked up, but Julia was already walking away, rubbing her belly and laughing with someone over baby names. Margaret sat down slowly, the bag in her lap. Inside was a single item, a simple necklace. Silver. A round pendant with a tree etched into it, branches wide, roots deep. No grand declarations, no applause. But something inside her shifted, quietly, like an old lock clicking free after years of rust. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of laughter, advice swapped over cupcakes, and toddlers chasing balloons across tile. Margaret found herself listening more than speaking, absorbing the soft rhythm of a room where no one kept score. No one expected performance, just presence. It wasn't the kind of family she'd once fought to preserve, but it was the kind that grew around shared kindness and hard truths, the kind that asked, "Are you okay?" and really wanted the answer. When the sun dipped low and guests began to trickle out with Tupperware and hugs, Julia walked Margaret to the door. "I know it's not traditional," she said, hands on the small of her back, "but I don't want this baby growing up thinking family means permission to be cruel." Margaret reached out, touched her cheek. "Then you're already the kind of mother I never got to be." Neither of them said anything more. The breeze picked up as Margaret stepped outside, the sky streaked in rose and ash, soft and vast. She walked down the sidewalk, her heels clicking lightly against the concrete. In her pocket, the necklace felt cool and solid against her palm. Behind her, laughter rose through the bakery windows, real and messy and whole. And for the first time since leaving Meadow Lane, Margaret didn't feel like she'd lost anything. She felt claimed. The quiet in the senior community wasn't sterile like hospitals or heavy like the hush of old houses filled with things unsaid. It was soft, earned, the kind of quiet people choose after decades of noise. Margaret's apartment overlooked a small courtyard with a white-painted gazebo and azaleas that bloomed early. A hummingbird visited her windowsill most mornings, drawn to the feeder she refilled religiously with red-dyed sugar water. She named it Franklin. It felt right. Her days fell into a rhythm no one dictated. She journaled in the mornings with black ink pens and fresh-lined notebooks, filling pages with reflections and recipes and tiny notes addressed to no one in particular. Afternoons were for walking the trail behind the building, where squirrels darted like rumors and the sun laid itself down across the benches like it had nowhere else to be. And evenings? Those were for baking, sometimes a cinnamon coffee cake for the retired Marine down the hall, sometimes molasses cookies she left on the stoop of apartment 1C for the widow who rarely spoke but always returned the empty tin with a note, "You remind me I still like people." The bookshelf in Margaret's living room was orderly and intentional. Fiction on the top shelf, cookbooks below. 2 small framed photos sat on the middle tier. One was of Julia, laughing wide and full of teeth, her baby on her hip, sunlight catching in their curls. The other was of that same baby, reaching for Margaret's glasses with pudgy fingers, mid-giggle. There were no pictures of Ethan. None of Brittany. Not even in a drawer. Some people vanish slowly from a life. Others are removed like a tumor, cut out, healed over. One afternoon in early spring, Margaret opened her email to find a subject line she hadn't seen in almost a year. From ethan.langley@gmail.com, subject, trying. She hesitated, then clicked. "Mom, I know things got ugly. We're struggling. Brittany's parents aren't helping, and daycare's impossible. Please consider helping us for the baby's sake. I miss how things used to be." Margaret read it twice. Not for clarity, but to check for something that wasn't there. Accountability. Apology. Respect. She hovered over the reply button, then clicked delete. No anger, no triumph, just choice. Help was never the problem, she thought, closing the laptop. Respect was. That evening, Julia arrived with the baby in a carrier and a basket of strawberries from the farmer's market. She kissed Margaret on the cheek like it was tradition now. Margaret pulled a bottle from the fridge without asking. There was always one chilling, always a space in her kitchen drawer filled with extra bibs, a soft rattle that squeaked, and a well-used burp cloth that smelled faintly of lavender. They ate on the porch, Julia on the step, Margaret in the old rocking chair with a quilt tucked over her knees. The baby cooed in her lap, fighting sleep like joy had made her restless. "I applied to the night program," Julia said, eyes scanning the dusky sky. "They said if I pass the interview, I'm in." "You'll get in," Margaret replied. "You already belong there." They sat in easy silence as the wind stirred through the trees, dusk spreading its indigo wings overhead. Porch lights blinked on across the complex, one by one, like a quiet applause for simply making it to another night. When Julia rose to leave, the baby fussed. Margaret stood, reaching. "Let me rock her a little," she said. "I'll bring her down when she's out." Julia nodded, trusting, her tired smile held together by love and gumption. Margaret sank into the rocker, the baby cradled against her chest, breath soft and rhythmic against her collarbone. She looked down at the little face, fingers wrapped around one of hers like a secret. For years, Margaret had tried to hold on to a version of family that looked good from the outside, but left her hollow. This wasn't that. This was real. She rocked gently, the chair creaking in time with the crickets outside. The baby yawned, nuzzled close, and Margaret whispered with a certainty that didn't need to be loud, "You are what's mine now."